right, so picking up from where we left off last time, we'll real quick just go through these chapter 3 notes that we went through, right? So every society has to answer 3 basic questions, right? What are we producing, how are we producing, and how are we going to distribute it? So in the what, we're trying to decide which goods and how much. How many loaves of bread, how many PlayStations, how many pants, how many apples, so on and so forth, right? And then how much? So it's which ones and then how much. The how is going to be which technology are we going to use? Are we going to have people picking the apples by hand? Are we going to have some sort of robot do it? What resources are we going to use? So the land, the labor, the entrepreneurship, all those different things. For whom? How are these outputs distributed, right? And this is really where we get into a more political economy kind of question, right? In terms of, is it distributed based on need? Is it distributed based on income, right? Right now we have a system, a mixed economy, where it is based on both, right? That there's a certain amount of social safety nets. There's a certain amount of government subsidies for, first home owners tax credit and having a family tax credit and things like that, right? And in a way, that's a distribution of output based on need. But for the most part, we see ourselves as this capitalist economy, right? And so we see the outputs being distributed by income. But is that right? That's again, a different question, right? Especially when we kind of get into excesses of, hedge fund managers getting paid $10 billion as a bonus for a year of work or something like that, right? It's like, how is that the income that they provide? How's that the value that they provided to the world? It starts to really stretch the belief system, right? So historically, we've had market systems and central planning systems that answered these decisions. In terms of central planning, they were made by small groups. So we still have central planning to this day in terms of government programs, in terms of Medicaid, Medicare, supplemental nutritional assistance programs, formerly known as food stamps, assistance for mothers and things like that. The problem with this, again, is it a bug, is it a feature, is that individual influence is limited in these kind of central planning things, right? Compared to the market, we have buyers and sellers that are signaling their wants and costs through prices. This is how the resources and goods are allocated, and it's through supply and demand interactions that the questions of which goods, how many goods, and how are they distributed gets answered. A mixed economy, which the United States is, and almost all developed countries are use both market and central planning. So at the end of the day, the buyers want to benefit from the good, the sellers want to make a profit. We have to balance these two forces, and we're going to do that using the market price. All right, let's go ahead and jump into some new notes now. Talk about demand. So a demand curve looks a little something like this. We have price on the y-axis, we have quantity on the x-axis, and our demand curve is downward sloping. So this demand curve, it is a schedule. It illustrates how many, the quantity, buyers would purchase at each given price. So for instance, at $4, let's say that this is the demand for pizzas. So at $4, and well, it's going to be a slice of pizza. At $4, we are told by the demand schedule that there will be 8,000 slices sold that day. What happens when we lower the price? By lowering the price, when we reflect that price off of the demand curve as if it's like a mirror, right? We reflect it off of there, boop, pew. And now we are selling 16,000. So we have cut the price in half, and we are doubling the amount of pizza we're selling. This illustrates the law of demand. As the price goes down, quantity demanded increases. Consumers are always going to buy more at lower prices, and they're going to buy less at higher prices, right? And we know this because we have seen this ourselves, right? In terms of when we go to Walmart or we go to Safeway and we're shopping for something, and all of a sudden, oh, the price of Tombstone pizzas is increased or something, so I'm gonna buy some other type. I'm gonna buy the generic pizza or whatever, right? Or maybe or maybe the price of it has gone down. There's a sale on them, and it's a frozen pizza that I know I'm going to eat a bunch, so I'm going to buy 7 of them, right? Instead of buying 2. So my individual demand has increased because of the price change. So why is this demand downward sloping? Well, buyers, right? There's no apostrophe there. We value goods and services, and I'm just going to start abbreviating goods and services with G&S because we use it so much in this class. So buyers value goods and services differently. One of our key terms that we have is something called a buyer's reservation price. And this is defined to be the highest price that an individual is willing to pay, and willing to pay is often abbreviated as WTP, willingness to pay. So it's the most that an individual is willing to pay for a good or service. Lower prices bring more consumers to the market. Lower prices cause existing consumers to purchase more. Questions on that? All right, moving on. Supply curve. So the supply curve, this is going to illustrate the quantity of the good that sellers are willing to offer at each price. So a supply curve looks something like this. We still have price on the y-axis. We still have quantity on the x-axis. And now we are going to have something that is upward sloping. And if we have some difficulty remembering which is which, right, there are some mnemonics to help us remember which ones slope upwards and which ones slope downwards, right? Supply, up is right in the name, right? It's upward sloping. Demand, right, is downward sloping. So demand is downward sloping, right? You can use that mnemonic. And supply is upward sloping. So the sellers are undergoing these calculations, and they're figuring out that if the price is less than their opportunity cost, then what are they going to do? They're going to offer or sell more. Why do we see multiple opportunity costs for different sellers? There's a variety of reasons. So we've got technology, skills, different costs such as rent, and just different expectations in terms of future prices, in terms of maybe, undercutting in order to grab a bunch of market share, to drive somebody out of business, so on and so forth. So what do we call this price? We call it a seller's reservation price. And it's the lowest that the seller would be willing to sell for. So back to our graph. If we have this as the supply of pizza slices, at $4, we find that there are 16,000 slices of pizza provided. Whereas at $2, what do we expect to happen to the number of slices of pizza that are on the market to be sold? Is it going to go up or down? Down. It's going to go down to 8,000. So at $2, suppliers are only willing to sell 8,000 a day. At $4, they're willing to sell 16,000, right? So you're willing to stay open longer. You're willing to start delivering. You're willing to open a to-go window or something like that, right? So the sellers are going to change their behavior because the new price is above their old opportunity cost. And so they're going to, it's an incentivization for them to provide more. Okay, questions on supply or demand? Just the kind of bare bones definitions, what they are. Demand is that schedule of how much we're willing to pay for stuff. The more or the cheaper it is, the more that we purchase, the cheaper it is, the more there's new consumers that are going to buy it. Supply is the reservation prices of all the different sellers. At a higher price, sellers are going to be providing more because it's now exceeding their higher and higher opportunity cost, because essentially your opportunity cost increases the more you make. There's a law of diminishing returns that we'll get to. But yeah. So let's put them all together. Putting it all together, we get something called market equilibrium. And so a market, or so a system, so let's just talk just in general about what equilibrium is. So a system is in equilibrium when there is no tendency for it to change. A market equilibrium occurs when all buyers and sellers are satisfied with their respective quantities at the market price. At the equilibrium price, our quantity supplied equals our quantity demanded. So let's go ahead and put it together graphically. And so we find that at $3, there are 12,000 that are supplied, and there are 12,000 that are demanded. And so this is our market equilibrium at $3 and 12,000 slices of pizza. The buyers are on their demand curve, the sellers are on their supply curve. There's no reason for them to deviate from this. This is our equilibrium. Questions on this? Okay. And the dynamics of this are going to be a little bit more easy to understand once we start to kind of mess with it a little bit and push it a little bit, give it some perturbations, right? So let's talk about what happens when there's excess supply. So let's talk about what happens when there's excess supply of pizza. So we find that at $4, given the existing willingness to buy, purchase, right? The WTP, the willingness to purchase of the buyers, giving the existing reservation prices of all the different sellers, at $4, we find that we have a quantity demanded that is 8,000 slices of pizza, and we have a quantity supplied that is 16,000. Uh-oh, they're not the same. What does that mean? We are not at equilibrium here, right? There is what's called a surplus. And this surplus is equal to the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So this is going to be 16,000 minus 8,000, so it'll be 8,000. That is my surplus. So what ends up happening if this is the situation? There's 8,000 pieces of pizza that are being prepared that the sellers want to sell, but there's 16,000 that are being prepared that the sellers want to sell, but only 8,000 of them are being purchased and consumed. So it's in the seller's best interest to not have that surplus exist, right? Partly because, especially with pizzas, it's going to go bad, right? It's a perishable thing. So you can't just say, oh, I'll just sell the pizza the next day, right? Because the next day it's not going to be as good. But even if it was something that was not perishable, right? Even if it was something like a consumer electronic, right? It still costs money to store that thing. You still have to warehouse it. You still have to pay somebody to run inventory. You still have to maybe run security on it or cameras or something like that, right? And then also, even if you do all that, you run the risk of the item becoming obsolete, right? VHS players, DVD players, if somebody had a warehouse full of them because of some surplus situation and held onto it for 10 years, right? They're worthless now. So at the end of the day, it is in the best incentive for the seller. And again, we're assuming that these people are rational, they have well-defined goals, and they are going to pursue those goals. So the seller is going to go ahead and lower that price up until the point where the quantity meets the supply. So there's downward pressure here for us to get back to that equilibrium. And so this is the first part of what we call the stability of the equilibrium, right? If there's a deviation to the north of the equilibrium, right? If the price all of a sudden is too high, the incentives are such that the seller is going to lower the price to get rid of that excess supply. And so over time, we're going to tend towards that equilibrium. Does that make sense to everybody? Because that excessive supply costs money. They'd rather get something than nothing. They'd rather get $3 for those extra 8,000 slices of pizza than nothing, right? Okay, what about excessive demand? Price, quantity, pizzas. Now we're going to have $2 as the price. Well, at $2, we've only got 8,000 slices that are being supplied. But at $2, we've got 16,000 slices that are demanded. And so this is what we call a shortage. And so for very similar reasons, the suppliers are going to see that there's all this unmet demand, right? There's all this extra demand out there for pizza. And so they are going to increase their price and the quantity that they are producing up until the point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And so again, this is that second part of the stability. There's a tendency, right? Regardless of where the price is, if it's above the X marks the spot, below the X marks the spot, there's a tendency for it to gravitate towards where those two curves meet. Questions on excess supply, excess demand? Okay. Let's talk about some shifts in demand. So, our shifts in demand. What happens when buyers are willing to purchase more at any given price? If they're willing to consume more at any price, then that means that demand must have shifted outwards or increased. So if at $2, the original demand was 8,000 slices of pizza per day, but then all of a sudden something happened, maybe a news study came out and said that the red sauce in pizza is helpful for cardio or like anti-cancer property or something like that, right? That tomatoes are good for fighting cancer, and so as a result, pizzas are not as unhealthy as they were before, right? So as a result, there would be a shift in demand outwards. We would end up with a D prime. And at this D prime, we would now see that 10,000 slices of pizza are going to be demanded at $2. So it's important for us to contrast this with a movement along the demand curve. A movement along the demand curve happens when price changes. So if the price goes up, there's a movement along the demand curve, and we end up with a decrease in what the quantity demanded. Not demand. A decrease in demand, just for sake of completeness, would look something like this. Shifting to the left. So shift to the right is an increase in demand. It has to do with the fact that people are willing to purchase more at any given price. A movement along the demand has to do with changes in the price. So it's going to be really difficult to not fall into this trap. A lot of students fall into it. They say, well, the price decreased, so demand increased. No. Price decreased, so quantity demanded increased. Price is already baked into the model. So price can never be something that actually shifts demand. All right, questions on that? Shifts in demand, movements along demand. Okay. We'll do shifts in supply, movements along supply, and then we'll call it a day. I will, I'll move chapter 4 to next week, since we haven't covered it. So, shifts in supply. So, supply increases when sellers are willing to offer more at any possible price. So at $2, if all of a sudden the sellers used to only want to sell 8,000 and now want to sell 16,000, that's a shift outwards in supply. So supply increases only when sellers are willing to offer more at any given price. Whereas, again, just like with demand, we have to be very careful that we don't confuse these things. A movement along the supply curve, that is just when price goes up or down. So when price goes up or down, this results in a change in the quantity supplied. Never a change in the supply. A shift in supply, that's over there. Okay, there's a few different reasons why demand and supply shift. So I implore you to study those on your own. They will be on the quiz. You'll have 2 attempts, and it's not due till Monday night. So go ahead and at least take one of those attempts. We'll cover those shifts, and we'll cover any questions you guys might have on Monday. There'll be a Friday activity. Please go ahead and do it. Give it your best shot. You'll have 2 attempts just like last week, and enjoy the beautiful day.